plate shattered against the kitchen floor before Clara Whitfield even realized her hand had let it go. Edmund stood in the doorway, keys jingling in his fist, telling her he would not be home for dinner again, and something in her chest cracked louder than the porcelain at her feet. She did not cry. She had not cried in years. She simply bent down, picked up the pieces one by one, and placed them in the bin, while her husband walked past her without a single word about the mess he had caused. This was her 40th year on Earth, and Clara could count on one hand the mornings she had woken up and thought about what she wanted. Every other morning belonged to someone else. It had belonged to her younger brother and sister after their parents died in a car accident when Clara was only 19. It had belonged to her own 2 children when they were small and needed feeding, bathing, comforting through fevers and nightmares. Then it belonged to Margaret, her mother-in-law, whose health had declined so sharply over the past 3 years that Clara had become her nurse, her cook, and her only visitor most days. Clara stood at the kitchen sink that evening, washing the same dishes she had washed the night before and the night before that, and caught her reflection in the window above the tap. The woman looking back at her had fine lines at the corners of her eyes and a tiredness that no amount of sleep could erase. She barely recognized her. Somewhere between raising her siblings and raising her children and caring for an old woman who called her by the wrong name half the time, Clara Whitfield had vanished, and in her place stood someone who existed only to serve. Her son Oliver came downstairs first, 17 years old and already carrying his father's habit of speaking to her as though she were furniture that occasionally spoke back. He asked if his shirts were ironed. He did not ask how her day had gone. Her daughter Beatrice, 15, followed shortly after, complaining that the eggs were cold, though Clara had made them fresh 20 minutes earlier and simply not had a chance to serve them because she had been changing Margaret's bedsheets upstairs. Nobody in that house seemed to notice that Clara had not sat down to eat a full meal in longer than she could remember. Nobody noticed the small tremor in her hands by the end of most days, or the way she sometimes stood very still in the hallway for a moment before continuing on to the next task, as though gathering the last of her strength from some hidden reserve that was running dangerously low. That night, after Margaret had been settled, after the children had gone up to their rooms, after Edmund had finally returned smelling faintly of expensive cologne that was not his own, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who had wanted to study art in London before her parents died and everything changed. She wondered where that girl had gone, and whether she still existed anywhere at all, or whether 40 years had simply worn her down to nothing. The next morning brought a different kind of disruption. Edmund announced over a rushed breakfast that he was bringing a business associate home for dinner that evening, someone important, someone he needed to impress. He did not ask if this was convenient. He did not consider that Clara already had a full day ahead of her, caring for his mother, running the household, managing the endless list of small emergencies that came with keeping a family of 5 afloat. He simply told her to make sure everything was perfect, the way he always did, as though perfection cost nothing and required no labor at all. Clara spent the day in a blur of preparation. She cooked a meal fit for a small celebration, cleaned every visible surface in the house, changed Margaret into her best cardigan, and pressed Edmund's shirt herself because he complained the last one had a wrinkle near the collar. By the time evening arrived, she had not stopped moving for 11 hours straight, and her feet ached in a way that had become so familiar she barely registered it anymore. The associate turned out to be a man named Henry Ashcombe, though Edmund had failed to mention, perhaps deliberately, that Henry held the title of Duke of Rothmere. He arrived exactly on time, dressed simply for a man of his standing, and greeted Clara with a warmth that caught her off guard. Most of Edmund's business contacts treated her like part of the furnishings, a pleasant enough backdrop to their conversations about contracts and profits. Henry did not. He thanked her for the meal before he had even tasted it, complimenting the effort visible in every dish on the table. Edmund waved this away impatiently, eager to steer the conversation toward business matters, but Henry seemed in no hurry. He asked Clara where she had learned to cook so well, and when she mentioned, almost apologetically, that she had taught herself out of necessity after her parents passed, something shifted in his expression. He asked what she had wanted to do before necessity took over. The question landed strangely in her chest, unfamiliar and heavy, because no one had asked her that in 20 years. Clara hesitated, unsure how to answer a question she had buried so deep she had almost forgotten the answer existed. Finally, quietly, she admitted she had once wanted to paint. Henry did not laugh, did not dismiss it as a childish fancy the way Edmund surely would have. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though she had told him something important, and asked what kind of painting had interested her most. Before she could answer, Edmund interrupted, redirecting the conversation back to the trade agreement he hoped to secure with Henry's estate. Clara fell silent again, retreating into the role she knew best, refilling glasses and clearing plates, while the two men spoke of numbers and negotiations. But she noticed, throughout the rest of the evening, that Henry's eyes returned to her more than once, not with the polite disinterest she had grown used to from visitors, but with something closer to genuine curiosity. When dinner ended and Henry prepared to leave, he thanked Clara again, this time for her hospitality, and for what he called an unexpectedly thoughtful conversation. He shook her hand with a firmness that felt respectful rather than merely formal, and told her he hoped they might speak again sometime. Clara smiled politely and said nothing, assuming the comment was simply courtesy, the kind of thing important men said out of habit. After Henry's car pulled away from the house, Edmund's mood shifted immediately. He turned to Clara in the hallway, his expression sharp with irritation rather than gratitude for the evening she had spent preparing everything to his exact standards. He told her she had embarrassed him, going on about her silly dreams of painting in front of a man he was trying to impress. He said it made her sound foolish, like a woman who did not understand her place, and that she needed to remember who she was talking to next time. Clara stood very still as he spoke, absorbing the words the way she had absorbed so many others over the years, without protest, without argument. But something inside her, some small ember she had thought long extinguished, flickered faintly at the memory of Henry's question, of the way he had actually waited for her answer instead of speaking over her. That night, lying awake beside a husband who had already fallen asleep without another word to her, Clara stared at the ceiling and let herself think, for the first time in longer than she could remember, about who she might have become if her life had gone differently. She thought about the girl who had once dreamed of London, of canvases and color, of a future entirely her own. She wondered if that girl was truly gone forever, or if some small part of her was simply waiting, patiently, for someone to ask the right question at the right moment. Before sleep finally took her, Clara's mind drifted back further, to a memory she rarely allowed herself to visit. She remembered standing in her childhood bedroom at 19, the day after the funeral, folding her acceptance letter to an art college in London into a small square, and placing it at the bottom of a drawer. She had told herself it was temporary, that she would apply again once her brother and sister were settled, once things were calmer, once she had a little more time. But calm never came. One responsibility simply replaced another, year after year, until the letter at the bottom of that drawer became a relic of a life she had quietly agreed to abandon without ever truly deciding to. She thought of her sister, grown now and living abroad with a family of her own, who called twice a year and never once asked what Clara had given up to raise her. She thought of her brother, who had built a comfortable life for himself and rarely mentioned the years Clara had spent working 2 jobs to keep him fed and in school. Not out of cruelty, she understood, but out of a kind of blindness that comes naturally to those who have always been cared for. They simply did not know what it had cost her, because she had never let them see the cost. Clara turned onto her side, listening to Edmund's steady breathing beside her, and wondered when exactly she had stopped expecting anyone to ask. She thought of Margaret down the hall, sleeping fitfully, needing checking on again before morning. She thought of Oliver's ironed shirts and Beatrice's cold eggs, and the 1,000 small demands that would begin again the moment the sun rose. And yet, beneath all of it, Henry's question kept surfacing, gentle and insistent, like a stone dropped into still water that refused to stop rippling. What kind of painting had interested her most? Such a simple question, and yet no one had thought to ask it in 20 years. Clara did not know what to make of the fact that a stranger, a man she had met only hours earlier, had seen something in her that her own family had long since stopped looking for. Downstairs, forgotten on the hallway table, sat Henry's business card, left behind almost carelessly when he had shaken her hand goodbye. Clara did not know yet that this small, overlooked object would become the first thread in a story that would eventually unravel everything she thought she understood about her own life, about duty, about sacrifice, and about what it truly meant to matter to someone. For now, she only knew that for the first time in as long as she could recall, she had gone to sleep thinking about herself, rather than about everyone she was responsible for. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, the kind of shift that could easily be forgotten by morning, but it was there, quiet and persistent, like the first crack of light through a door that had been closed for 20 years. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a gas bill and a flyer for a supermarket sale, and Clara almost threw it away, without noticing the handwriting was not printed but real ink, careful and deliberate, addressed to her by name rather than to the household in general. She stood in the front hallway with Margaret calling faintly from upstairs, needing her medication, and Beatrice shouting down that she could not find her school shoes. And still Clara found herself frozen for a moment, staring at her own name written by a hand she did not recognize. She slipped the envelope into her apron pocket before either child could ask about it, and did not open it until much later that night, after the house had finally gone quiet. The letter was short. Henry Ashcombe thanked her again for the meal and for the evening, praised Edmund's business proposal in a few polite lines clearly meant for the household in general, and then, in a separate paragraph near the bottom, wrote something meant only for her. He said he had not stopped thinking about her mention of painting, and that he hoped she had not entirely given up on the idea, because talent wasted was one of the great quiet tragedies of the world, and he suspected she had more of it than she gave herself credit for. Clara read the paragraph 3 times before folding the letter and pressing it flat against her chest for a moment, as though she could absorb the words directly into her skin. No one had called her talented in longer than she could remember. No one had suggested that anything she wanted mattered as much as what everyone else needed from her. She sat on the edge of her bed, Edmund already snoring softly beside her, and felt something she had not felt in years, a small, stubborn spark of hope. She told herself the letter meant nothing beyond simple courtesy, the kind of gracious gesture a wealthy man might extend without much thought. But she kept it anyway, tucked inside the lining of an old sewing box where Edmund would never think to look, and found herself returning to those few sentences again and again over the following days, whenever the demands of the house grew too heavy to bear silently. Life did not pause to accommodate Clara's small private hope. Margaret's health worsened that week, requiring 2 visits from the doctor and an adjustment to her medication that left her confused and frightened through the nights, calling out for a husband who had been dead for over a decade. Clara sat with her for hours at a time, holding her hand, speaking softly until the older woman settled, all while Edmund complained from the next room that the noise was disrupting his sleep before an important meeting. Oliver's school called about a matter Clara had to handle personally, since Edmund claimed he was too busy with the Rothmere contract to spare an afternoon. Beatrice, meanwhile, had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending hours locked in her room, and when Clara gently tried to ask what was troubling her daughter, she was met with a sharp response that she wouldn't understand anyway, since she never had anything going on in her own life worth discussing. The words stung more than Clara let herself admit. She retreated to the kitchen afterward and stood at the sink, hands submerged in soapy water she no longer noticed had gone cold, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of quiet grief before straightening her shoulders and returning to the endless list of tasks that made up her days. It was during this difficult stretch that a second letter arrived from Henry, this one slightly longer, describing a charity event he had attended and a painting he had seen there that reminded him, he said, of something Clara might create if given the chance. He asked, almost shyly for a man of his position, whether she might ever consider showing him something she had made, even an old sketch from years ago, if such a thing still existed. Clara did not respond right away. She sat with the letter for 2 full days, turning the question over in her mind, both flattered and frightened by the attention. Writing back felt like admitting that some part of her still wanted something for herself, and admitting that felt dangerous in a house where wanting things for oneself was treated as a character flaw rather than a basic human need. Eventually, late one night after Margaret had finally settled and the children were asleep, Clara climbed into the attic and searched through boxes she had not opened in over a decade. She found, beneath old baby clothes and forgotten school books, a thin folder of drawings from her youth, pencil sketches of hands and faces, and a few tentative attempts at watercolor landscapes. Her breath caught looking at them. They were not perfect, but they held a spark of genuine talent, a way of seeing light and shadow that she had entirely forgotten she once possessed. She sat on the dusty attic floor for a long while, tracing the lines of her younger self's work with trembling fingers, mourning the years that had passed and the person she might have become if circumstances had been kinder. Then, carefully, she selected one drawing, a simple study of a bird in flight, and decided, with a courage that surprised her, to send it to Henry along with a brief reply. Her return letter was cautious, formal in tone, thanking him for his kind words and enclosing the drawing only because he had asked so directly. She made no mention of wanting anything more from the exchange, no suggestion that his attention had come to mean something important to her during a week that had otherwise felt unbearably heavy. She told herself this correspondence was simply a small kindness between acquaintances, nothing more, and that she would let it end there if he did not write again. He wrote again within days. His response was warmer than she expected, filled with genuine admiration for the drawing, noting details in the composition that revealed, he said, a natural eye for movement and emotion, rarely found even in trained artists. He asked, gently, whether she had ever considered taking proper lessons, and mentioned, almost in passing, that he knew several instructors in the city who would likely be honored to work with someone of her evident ability. Clara read this letter standing in the kitchen, one hand pressed against the counter for support, overwhelmed by an offer that felt both wonderful and impossible in equal measure. She could not imagine explaining art lessons to Edmund, could not picture finding the hours in a schedule already stretched beyond its limits caring for Margaret and the children and the house. And yet the idea planted itself in her mind and refused to leave, growing a little each day, watered by every stolen moment she spent thinking about Henry's letters, rather than the endless demands surrounding her. During this same stretch of weeks, Clara found herself confiding, in small careful pieces, in an old friend named Lucy Bennett, who ran a small flower shop 2 streets over, and had known Clara since they were girls. Lucy had always possessed a directness that Clara both admired and slightly feared, and when Clara mentioned, almost casually, that a business associate of Edmund's had written to compliment an old drawing of hers, Lucy set down the flowers she was arranging and looked at her friend with an expression far too knowing for comfort. Lucy asked plainly whether this associate wrote often, and Clara, caught off guard, admitted that he did. She tried to explain it away as simple friendliness, the kind of correspondence any thoughtful person might maintain, but Lucy only shook her head slowly, not with judgment, but with a kind of sad recognition. She told Clara that she had watched her disappear a little more each year since they were young women together, and that whatever this correspondence was, kindness or something more, Clara owed herself the honesty of admitting what it made her feel. Clara left the flower shop that afternoon unsettled, turning Lucy's words over in her mind as she walked home past rows of houses that all looked the same, wondering when exactly she had become so practiced at lying to herself. She thought of the folder of old drawings still hidden in the attic, of the letters tucked inside her sewing box, of the strange, fragile hope that had taken root in her chest despite every reason she had to ignore it. By the time she reached her own front door, she had decided nothing, resolved nothing, only carried the weight of Lucy's honesty, alongside everything else she already carried. That evening brought its own difficulties. Margaret refused her dinner entirely, growing agitated and tearful for reasons Clara could not immediately identify, and it took nearly an hour of gentle coaxing before the older woman finally settled enough to eat a few small bites. Beatrice, meanwhile, had received a poor mark on an important assignment and blamed her mother for not helping her study sooner, ignoring entirely the fact that Clara had offered twice that week and been turned away both times. Oliver said nothing at all during dinner, staring at his phone throughout the meal, and when Clara asked gently about his day, he answered in a single word before excusing himself from the table. Edmund arrived home late again, offering no explanation, smelling once more of a cologne Clara did not recognize as belonging to any bottle in their own home. She had noticed this before, more than once, and had always pushed the observation away, unwilling to examine what it might mean. That night, lying in bed beside a husband who barely acknowledged her presence, Clara allowed herself, for the first time, to wonder honestly whether her marriage had already ended in every way that mattered, long before either of them had said so aloud. The correspondence continued over the following weeks, always careful, always framed in terms that could withstand scrutiny if discovered. Discussions of art and books and small observations about the world that Henry seemed to notice more keenly than most people Clara had ever known. He asked about her siblings, her children, her early life, listening in his written words the way he had listened at that first dinner, with a patience and genuine interest that Clara had almost forgotten existed between two people. She began, without quite admitting it to herself, to look forward to the sound of the post arriving each morning, a small flutter of anticipation that felt dangerously close to something she had no right to feel toward a man who was not her husband. She told herself repeatedly that this was friendship, nothing more. A rare and precious connection with someone who happened to see value in her that her own family had long stopped noticing. Meanwhile, the demands of her household life grew no lighter. Edmund's business dealings with Henry's estate progressed steadily, requiring Clara to host 2 more formal dinners within a single month, each one demanding hours of preparation that left her exhausted long before the guests arrived. She managed these evenings with practiced grace, careful never to let her private correspondence with Henry show in her demeanor when he was present in the room, speaking to him with the same polite distance she extended to Edmund's other associates. Only once, during the second of these dinners, did their eyes meet for a moment longer than necessary, a brief acknowledgement passing between them of everything left unspoken in their letters, before Clara looked away and returned to refilling water glasses, her heart beating faster than the moment should have warranted. That night, after the guests had gone and Edmund had retreated to his study without a word of thanks for the evening's success, Clara stood alone in the darkened dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a dinner she had spent an entire day preparing, and allowed herself, finally, to acknowledge what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was not merely grateful for Henry's attention, she was beginning, quietly and against every instinct of duty and propriety she had spent her whole life honoring, to feel something for a man who saw her as a whole person, rather than a set of obligations to be managed. The realization frightened her more than anything else had in years, more than Margaret's failing health, more than the mounting exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Because feelings like this had no safe place in the life she had built, and yet, standing there in the quiet house that had never once felt entirely her own, Clara found she could not bring herself to wish the feeling away. She climbed the stairs slowly that night, pausing outside Margaret's door to listen for her breathing, then outside Beatrice's, then Oliver's, checking on each of them out of a habit so deep it had become instinct rather than choice. In her own room, she took out the folder of drawings she had begun keeping beside her bed, and studied once more the little sketch of the bird in flight that Henry had praised so warmly. She thought about wings, about the particular freedom of something built to leave the ground, and wondered, not for the first time, what it might feel like to want something simply because it was hers to want, without guilt, without apology, without first asking permission from anyone else in the house. She did not have an answer that night, only the quiet, persistent feeling that somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the duty and the years of disappearing into everyone else's needs, a part of her was slowly, carefully, beginning to wake up again. Edmund's hand slammed against the kitchen table so hard the sugar bowl toppled over, spilling white grains across the wood, and Clara flinched backward against the counter before she even understood what had caused his sudden fury. He held a bundle of envelopes in his other hand, her private letters, the ones she had believed safely hidden inside the lining of her old sewing box. His face had gone a deep shade of red she rarely saw outside his angriest moods, and his voice, when it finally came, was low and dangerous in a way that frightened her more than shouting ever could have. He wanted to know why a man like Henry Ashcombe was writing to his wife about paintings and feelings and things that had absolutely nothing to do with business. He wanted to know how long this had been going on, how many letters there had been, what exactly she had been doing behind his back while he worked to provide for this family. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing, searching for words that would not come, because the truth was complicated and she had spent weeks avoiding examining it too closely herself. She tried to explain that the letters were about art, about an old talent she had once possessed and nearly forgotten, that nothing improper had happened between herself and Henry, beyond kind words on paper. But Edmund was not interested in explanations. He had found what he considered proof of betrayal, and in his mind, the details no longer mattered. He accused her of making a fool of him in front of an important business partner, of risking everything he had built through her selfish, secret indulgence. Clara felt something shift inside her chest as he spoke, a familiar tightening that usually preceded her retreat into silence and apology, the pattern she had followed for 20 years whenever conflict arose in this house. But this time, something different rose alongside the fear. A quiet, steady anger that she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember, born not from the accusation itself, but from the sheer unfairness of being called selfish for the first genuine happiness she had experienced in over a decade. She found her voice before she fully decided to use it. She told Edmund, calmly at first, that she had done nothing to be ashamed of, that a stranger's kindness had reminded her of a person she used to be before duty consumed every part of her life. Edmund scoffed, dismissing her words as nonsense, and told her that a married woman had no business corresponding privately with any man, regardless of his intentions, and that her behavior reflected poorly on the entire family. The commotion had woken the children, who appeared in the kitchen doorway just as Edmund's voice rose further, Oliver looking uncertain, and Beatrice's expression already hardening into judgment, before she had heard a single detail of what had actually happened. Edmund turned to them immediately, painting Clara's private correspondence as something scandalous and shameful, watching their reactions with something close to satisfaction, as their faces shifted from confusion to disapproval. Beatrice spoke first, her voice sharp with the particular cruelty only a teenager confident in her own righteousness can summon, asking her mother how she could do something so embarrassing to the family after everything they had given her. The words landed like a physical blow, because Clara understood, with painful clarity, that her daughter genuinely believed the household had given her something, when in truth Clara had spent every waking hour of the past 2 decades giving everything she had to keep that same household functioning. Oliver said little, but his silence carried its own judgment, his eyes avoiding hers as he retreated back toward the stairs without offering a single word in her defense. Clara watched her children align themselves with their father's version of events without hesitation, without curiosity about her side of the story, and something inside her, Some final thread of patience that had held for 20 years finally gave way. She spoke then, not loudly, but with a clarity and steadiness that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She reminded them, one by one, of everything she had given up for this family. She reminded Edmund that she had abandoned her own education, her own dreams, to raise her siblings after her parents died, and had never once received a word of gratitude for it from anyone in this house. She reminded her children of the countless nights she had sat awake beside their sickbeds, the years she had spent managing every detail of their lives so they never had to worry about anything beyond their own comfort. She reminded Edmund, her voice growing steadier with each word, that she had cared for his mother with more patience and tenderness than his own visits ever showed, changing sheets and administering medication, and sitting through confused, frightened nights while he complained from the next room about the noise disrupting his sleep. She asked him, directly, whether he had ever once, in 20 years of marriage, asked her what she wanted for herself, the way a stranger had managed to ask within minutes of meeting her. The kitchen fell into stunned silence. Edmund's face had shifted from anger to something closer to shock, unaccustomed to hearing his wife speak with such unwavering directness after 2 decades of quiet compliance. Beatrice looked away, some flicker of doubt crossing her expression for the first time, though she said nothing to soften her earlier accusation. Oliver remained on the stairs, frozen, clearly unsure what to make of a mother he had never before seen defend herself. Clara did not wait for a response. She turned and walked calmly upstairs, packed a small bag with essential belongings, and informed Edmund, in a voice that left no room for argument, that she needed time away from the house to think clearly, away from accusations and shouting, and a family that seemed to expect endless sacrifice while offering nothing in return. Edmund followed her to the doorway, his anger cooling slightly into something closer to disbelief, warning her that leaving would only make things look worse, that people would talk, that she was being irrational and dramatic over nothing more than a few letters. Clara did not argue with him further. She simply walked past him, out the front door, into the cool evening air, feeling both terrified and strangely liberated by her own actions, as though she had finally stepped outside a cage she had lived inside for so long she had stopped noticing its bars. She drove to Lucy's small flat above the flower shop, arriving with little more than a bag of clothes and a heart pounding from adrenaline and fear in equal measure. Lucy took one look at her friend's face and asked no questions beyond whether Clara needed tea or something stronger, ushering her inside without judgment, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as though she were a woman recovering from an injury rather than an argument. Clara sat on Lucy's small sofa for a long while, unable to speak, replaying the scene in the kitchen over and over. The accusations, her children's faces, the words she had finally found the courage to say aloud after decades of silence. She had expected to feel regret, or at least uncertainty, but instead she felt something closer to relief. The exhausted, disoriented relief of setting down a weight she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. Lucy sat beside her eventually, saying little at first, simply offering the quiet comfort of her presence. When Clara finally began to speak, the words came slowly, then faster, describing everything that had happened. The letters, Henry's kindness, Edmund's fury, her children's judgment, the years of invisible sacrifice that had led to this single explosive evening. Lucy listened without interrupting, her expression steady and warm, until Clara finally fell silent, emptied of words for the first time in hours. Lucy told her, gently but firmly, that nothing about wanting to be seen as a whole person was shameful, that Clara had spent her entire adult life pouring herself into others without ever once being asked what she needed in return, and that no family, however much love existed beneath the resentment, had the right to demand endless sacrifice while offering nothing back. She reminded Clara that recognizing her own worth after so many years of dismissal was not selfishness but survival. Clara stayed at Lucy's flat that night, sleeping fitfully on the small sofa, her mind cycling through fear about her children, worry about Margaret's care in her absence, and a strange, persistent thread of something like hope whenever her thoughts drifted toward Henry and the letters that had somehow led her to this unexpected turning point. She did not know yet what would happen next, whether her marriage could survive this rupture, whether her children would ever understand her side of events, or whether the fragile connection with Henry meant anything beyond kind words exchanged between two people who had recognized something familiar in each other's loneliness. The following morning brought a message from Edmund, terse and demanding, insisting she return home immediately to resume her responsibilities, particularly regarding his mother's care, since he claimed he could not possibly manage everything alone for even a single day. Clara read the message standing in Lucy's small kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands, and felt the familiar pull of guilt and obligation tugging at her resolve, the deeply ingrained instinct to abandon her own needs the moment someone else's inconvenience was mentioned. But alongside that familiar pull, something new had taken root, something steadier and more stubborn than guilt. She thought of Henry's letters, of the drawings hidden in the attic, of Lucy's words the night before about survival rather than selfishness. She thought of her own reflection in the kitchen window, the tired woman she had barely recognized, and wondered whether returning immediately, without any change in how she was treated, would simply mean sliding back into the same invisible existence she had lived for 20 years. She did not respond to Edmund's message right away. Instead, she called the home to check on Margaret directly, arranging for a temporary caregiver to assist for a few days while she took the time she desperately needed to think clearly about her own life, separate from the constant demands that had governed every decision she made for as long as she could remember. It was a small act, arranging her own absence rather than simply returning out of guilt, but it felt enormous, like the first genuinely independent decision she had made in years. Lucy watched her friend make these arrangements with quiet pride, offering encouragement without pushing her toward any particular outcome, understanding instinctively that Clara needed space to find her own way forward, rather than advice pulling her in one direction or another. The two women spent the following days in careful, quiet companionship, Clara helping occasionally in the flower shop between long walks and longer conversations, slowly beginning to remember what it felt like to exist without the constant weight of managing everyone else's needs. During this time, Clara found herself thinking constantly of Henry, wondering whether he had heard about the confrontation, whether Edmund's business relationship with his estate had suffered as a result, whether the correspondence that had upended her carefully ordered life would simply end now that it had caused such visible damage. She told herself she should feel regret for the disruption his letters had caused, and yet, whenever she recalled his words about her talent, about wanting to know what interested her most, she could summon no genuine regret at all, only a quiet gratitude that someone had finally seen her clearly enough to remind her she still existed as more than a set of obligations. On the second day of her absence, Edmund's mother called Clara's mobile directly, her voice frail and confused, asking why Clara had not come to help her dress that morning. Clara felt a fresh wave of guilt rise in her chest, sharp and immediate, the old instinct to drop everything and rush back into service reasserting itself with familiar strength. She spoke gently with Margaret for nearly 20 minutes, reassuring her, explaining that a kind woman named Susan would be helping her for a few days, walking her patiently through the arrangement until the older woman's confusion settled into something closer to acceptance. When the call ended, Clara sat with her phone in her lap for a long time, tears finally slipping free after days of holding herself together through sheer determination. She loved Margaret, genuinely, had cared for her with real tenderness through years of declining health, and leaving her now, even temporarily, felt like abandoning someone who depended entirely on her. Lucy found her like this on the small balcony, and sat beside her without a word, simply resting a hand on her shoulder, until the worst of the tears passed. It was Lucy who finally spoke the difficult truth Clara had been avoiding, gently reminding her that caring for Margaret with love did not require sacrificing every other part of herself in the process, that it was possible to be a devoted daughter-in-law and still deserve rest, still deserve a life beyond constant caregiving. She pointed out, carefully, that Edmund had 2 working legs, and a perfectly capable mind, and that his sudden helplessness the moment Clara stepped away for a few days revealed more about his own choices than about any genuine incapacity to manage his mother's care. Clara turned this thought over for the rest of that day, examining it from every angle, testing it against 20 years of instinct that told her any moment spent on herself was inherently selfish, a theft from those who needed her more. By evening, she had reached no firm conclusion, only a slightly steadier sense that perhaps the story she had told herself for 2 decades, the story where her own needs simply did not factor into the equation, had never been entirely true, only convenient for everyone around her who benefited from her endless availability. The third day passed more quietly. Clara helped Lucy arrange flowers for a wedding order, losing herself for a few peaceful hours in the simple, tactile pleasure of working with her hands, choosing colors and shapes without anyone questioning her decisions or demanding she hurry to the next task. It was such a small thing, arranging flowers with no urgency behind it, and yet Clara found herself close to tears again by the end of the afternoon, moved by how foreign it felt to spend hours doing something simply because it brought her a quiet, uncomplicated satisfaction. That evening, Beatrice called, her voice smaller and less certain than it had been during the confrontation in the kitchen. She did not apologize outright, but she asked, hesitantly, whether Clara was coming home soon, and admitted, almost reluctantly, that the house felt strange without her. Clara listened carefully to the things her daughter did not say, as much as the things she did, recognizing beneath the teenage bravado a genuine confusion about a mother who had always simply been there, absorbing every difficulty without complaint, suddenly absent for reasons Beatrice did not yet fully understand. Clara spoke gently with her daughter, neither rushing to reassure her that everything would return to normal, nor allowing herself to be guilted into an immediate return. She told Beatrice, calmly, that she loved her very much, and that she needed a little more time before coming home. Time to think clearly about some important things. Beatrice did not argue, though her silence on the other end of the line carried a weight of uncertainty that lingered with Clara long after the call ended. On the fourth day of her absence, a message arrived, not from Edmund, but from Henry himself, carefully worded and respectful, expressing concern after hearing secondhand that some difficulty had arisen within her household. He did not ask for details, did not press her for information she might not wish to share, only offered, simply and sincerely, to be of whatever assistance she might need, whether that meant conversation, practical help, or nothing more than knowing someone was thinking of her during a difficult time. Clara read the message several times, sitting on the small balcony outside Lucy's flat, watching the evening light fade over rooftops she had known her entire life but somehow, in that moment, saw with new eyes. She thought about everything that had led her to this point, the years of invisible sacrifice, the sudden confrontation, her children's judgment, her own unexpected courage in finally speaking her truth aloud. And she thought, too, about the strange, unearned kindness of a man who had asked, from the very first evening they met, what she wanted for herself, as though her wants had always mattered, even when no one else in her life had ever thought to ask. She did not yet know what she would decide about her marriage, about her family, about the fragile possibility Henry's letters represented. But sitting there in the fading light, feeling the cool evening air against her skin for the first time in years without a single task pulling at her attention, Clara understood that whatever came next, she could no longer return to the woman who had disappeared so completely into everyone else's needs that she had nearly forgotten her own name. The knock on Lucy's door came sharp and impatient, 3 quick raps that Clara recognized instantly as Edmund's, and her stomach tightened before she had even crossed the room to answer it. He stood on the small landing looking tired and irritated, dressed in the same suit he must have worn to work that day, his expression a careful mask of reasonableness that Clara had learned, over 20 years, to distrust completely. He told her he had come to bring her home, that this separation had gone on long enough, that people were beginning to notice her absence and ask uncomfortable questions he did not wish to answer. He spoke as though her return were a foregone conclusion, a simple matter of logistics rather than a genuine choice she might make for herself. Clara stepped outside onto the landing, pulling the door partly closed behind her, unwilling to have this conversation within earshot of Lucy's small flat. She asked him directly what had changed, whether he had given any real thought to the things she had said in the kitchen days earlier, whether he understood even slightly why she had needed to leave in the first place. Edmund's expression flickered with impatience, and he told her, somewhat dismissively, that he understood she had been upset, that perhaps he had spoken too harshly in the moment, but that surely she recognized how disruptive her behavior had been to the entire family. The apology, if it could even be called that, felt hollow to Clara, more concerned with restoring convenience than with genuinely reckoning with the years of imbalance between them. She asked him plainly whether he intended to help more with his mother's care, whether he planned to ask her, even occasionally, what she wanted or needed from her own life. Edmund hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directness of her questions, and finally admitted that he did not see why any of that needed to change, since the household had functioned perfectly well under the existing arrangement for years. Something settled in Clara's chest as he spoke, not the familiar ache of guilt she had expected, but a quiet, clarifying certainty. She realized, standing there on Lucy's landing with the evening air cooling around them, that Edmund had not come to understand her, only to retrieve her, the way one might retrieve a tool left temporarily out of place. He wanted his household restored to its previous efficiency, not a genuine partnership built on mutual understanding and respect. She told him, calmly, that she needed more time before making any decisions about returning home, and that she would continue arranging temporary care for Margaret in the meantime. Edmund's careful composure finally cracked, his voice rising as he accused her of abandoning her responsibilities, of choosing some foolish fantasy over the family that depended on her. He mentioned Henry by name, his tone dripping with contempt, suggesting that her sudden interest in independence had far more to do with a wealthy stranger's flattery than with any genuine grievance against her own husband. Clara did not flinch from the accusation, though it landed with more precision than Edmund likely intended. She told him honestly that Henry's letters had indeed made her think differently about her own life, not because she harbored some scandalous fantasy, but because a near stranger had managed, within a single evening, to ask her more questions about herself than her own husband had asked in 2 decades of marriage. She watched the words land, watched something shift briefly in Edmund's expression, a flicker that might have been genuine hurt beneath the anger, before hardening once more into defensive irritation. He left shortly after, warning her that her behavior was damaging the family's reputation, and that she would regret this choice eventually, when the novelty of independence wore thin, and she found herself alone with no one to rely on. Clara watched him walk back to his car, feeling neither triumphant nor entirely at peace, only exhausted by the weight of a conversation that had confirmed everything she already suspected about the true nature of her marriage. Back inside Lucy's small flat, Clara found her friend waiting with 2 cups of tea already poured, having watched the exchange on the landing through the front window without pretending otherwise. Lucy did not ask for details immediately, simply handed Clara a cup and let her settle into the worn armchair by the window before speaking. When Clara finally recounted the conversation, Lucy listened with her arms crossed, her expression growing sharper with every detail, particularly at the mention of Edmund's refusal to consider any real change to their arrangement. Lucy told her plainly that she had watched this pattern for years, long before the letters or the confrontation, and had simply never felt it was her place to say so uninvited. She reminded Clara of countless small moments over the past decade, birthdays forgotten by Edmund, illnesses endured largely alone, decisions made without consultation, that Clara had always explained away or excused, telling herself that this was simply what marriage required of a woman, that sacrifice without reciprocation was the price of stability. Lucy asked, gently but pointedly, whether stability without respect was truly worth calling by that name at all. Clara sat with the question long after Lucy had gone to bed that night, staring out at the darkened street below, turning the accusation over in her mind, not with defensiveness but with a slow, dawning recognition of its truth. She thought of all the years she had measured her own worth by how seamlessly the household functioned, how rarely anyone complained, mistaking the absence of complaint for the presence of contentment, when in truth it had only ever meant that her own needs had become so invisible that no one, including herself, thought to voice them. The days that followed brought further difficulty. Beatrice called again, this time more openly upset, having overheard her father's account of the conversation and now uncertain whether to be angry with her mother or worried for her. Oliver remained largely silent throughout this period, communicating only through brief, non-committal messages that gave Clara little insight into his true feelings about the unfolding situation. She ached for her children, understanding that they were caught in the middle of a conflict they had not created and did not fully understand, and yet she could not bring herself to simply return to the previous arrangement without any real change, knowing it would mean disappearing into invisibility once more. Margaret's temporary caregiver reported that the older woman was managing reasonably well, though she asked for Clara frequently, and this news brought its own quiet grief. Clara visited twice during this period, sitting with Margaret for an afternoon each time, tending to her with the same gentle patience she always had, careful to reassure the confused, aging woman that she had not been abandoned, only that circumstances required a temporary adjustment to her care. Margaret, in her clearer moments, seemed to sense something significant had shifted, and once, holding Clara's hand tightly, told her, with surprising lucidity, that she deserved more than what her son had ever given her. The comment stayed with Clara long after she left, turning over in her mind during the quiet evenings at Lucy's flat, evidence that even someone as dependent on her as Margaret had noticed, in her own way, the imbalance Clara had spent 2 decades pretending not to see clearly herself. It was during this uncertain stretch that Henry wrote again, more directly than he had allowed himself in previous letters, expressing genuine concern for her well-being, and asking, with careful respect, whether she might be willing to meet in person, away from the complications of correspondence and second-hand accounts, simply to talk honestly about everything that had happened. He made clear that he expected nothing beyond conversation, that he understood the delicacy of her situation and had no wish to complicate matters further, only that he cared about her, and wanted the chance to say so plainly, face to face, rather than through careful, measured letters that could never fully capture what he meant. Clara read this letter several times, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and fear that had accompanied every previous communication from him, but this time with an added layer of complexity, knowing that agreeing to meet would mean acknowledging, at least to herself, that whatever existed between them had grown into something neither of them could reasonably continue to call simple friendship. She thought of her marriage, fractured now beyond easy repair, of her children's confusion and hurt, of Margaret's unexpected words of encouragement, and finally, cautiously, wrote back agreeing to meet him at a quiet cafe, away from the small town where everyone knew her name and her business. The meeting itself, when it finally happened several days later, unfolded with a gentleness that surprised her. Henry arrived before she did, rising immediately when she entered, his expression careful and warm rather than presumptuous. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, first about small things, the weather, Lucy's flower shop, the drawings Clara had begun working on again during her quiet evenings away from home, before the conversation inevitably turned to more difficult territory. Henry told her plainly, without pressure or expectation, that he admired her more than he had admired anyone in a long time, not simply for her artistic talent, which he genuinely believed deserved cultivation, but for the quiet strength she had shown in finally speaking her truth to a family that had long taken her sacrifices for granted. He told her he understood she owed him nothing, that whatever decisions she made about her marriage and her future needed to come from her own clarity rather than any influence from him, and that he would respect whatever she chose, even if it meant their correspondence ended entirely. Clara listened to him with a fullness of attention she rarely allowed herself, moved by the simple fact that he seemed to want nothing from her beyond her own genuine happiness, a stance so foreign to the dynamics she had known within her marriage that it took her several long moments to fully absorb what he was offering. She told him honestly that she did not yet know what she wanted, that 20 years of prioritizing everyone else's needs had left her uncertain how to even begin identifying her own desires clearly, separate from guilt and obligation and fear of disappointing the people who depended on her. Henry nodded, unhurried, and told her that uncertainty was nothing to be ashamed of, that clarity often took time to emerge after so many years of suppression, and that he was willing to wait, patiently, for however long she needed, without any expectation that she owed him a particular outcome. The simple generosity of this offer moved Clara more than any grand romantic gesture could have, because it asked nothing of her beyond her own honest self-reflection, a gift she had rarely, if ever, received from anyone in her adult life. They parted that afternoon without any firm promises exchanged, only a quiet understanding that the connection between them, whatever it ultimately became, was real and worth honoring honestly, rather than rushing toward a conclusion neither of them fully understood yet. Clara drove back to Lucy's flat with her mind racing, turning over everything Henry had said, everything Edmund had failed to say, everything her children had revealed about their own understanding of her worth within the family. That night, sitting once more on the small balcony with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, Clara finally allowed herself to ask the question she had been avoiding for weeks, the question beneath all the others. Not whether she loved Henry, though something warm and hopeful had certainly grown between them, but whether she was ready, after 40 years of disappearing into everyone else's needs, to finally choose a life built around her own genuine happiness, even if that choice meant disappointing people who had never once considered disappointing her in return. She thought of the 2 hours spent with Henry that afternoon, how effortlessly the conversation had flowed compared to the careful, guarded exchanges she had grown used to at her own kitchen table. He had asked about her drawings again, wanting to know which subjects called to her most strongly now, after so many years away from the practice, and she had surprised herself by answering easily, describing an interest in painting hands, the particular story a person's hands could tell about the life they had lived, work-worn or gentle, steady or trembling. He had listened as though she were describing something profound rather than a small private observation, and she had felt, in that moment, the strange, unfamiliar pleasure of being taken seriously. She thought, too, of Margaret's words from her hospital bed days earlier, spoken with such unexpected clarity that she deserved more than her own son had ever given her, coming from a woman who had every reason to want Clara's undivided attention restored to her own care. The comment carried a weight that Clara could not easily dismiss. If even Margaret, dependent and vulnerable as she was, could see the imbalance clearly enough to name it aloud, then perhaps Clara had spent far too long convincing herself that naming it herself would be an act of selfishness, rather than simple honesty. Lying awake long after midnight, listening to the quiet sounds of Lucy's flat settling around her, Clara allowed herself to imagine, cautiously and without commitment, what a different life might look like. Not a life without her children, whom she loved fiercely and would never abandon, but a life where her own wants were not treated as an afterthought, where kindness flowed toward her as freely as it had always flowed from her toward everyone else. She did not yet know how to build such a life, or whether she possessed the courage to see the attempt through to its end, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like the beginning of an answer, forming slowly, steadily, in the quiet space she had finally allowed herself to occupy. The phone rang at 6 in the morning, jolting Clara from a shallow sleep, and her heart lurched with immediate fear before she even answered. certain that something terrible must have happened to Margaret or one of the children. It was Edmund, his voice tight and controlled in a way that unsettled her more than his earlier shouting had. He told her the Rothmere contract had fallen through overnight, that Henry had withdrawn from the business arrangement entirely without clear explanation, and that Edmund suspected, with barely restrained fury, that Clara's continued absence and her ongoing connection to the man had somehow ruined months of careful negotiation. He demanded to know what she had said to Henry, what promises or complaints she had made that could have damaged his business so severely. Clara sat up straighter in Lucy's small guest bed, her mind racing to make sense of this unexpected development. She had not spoken to Henry about business matters at all during their meeting days earlier, had barely mentioned Edmund beyond acknowledging that her marriage had reached a difficult point. She told Edmund honestly that she knew nothing about any withdrawal from the contract, that their conversation had touched only briefly on her own circumstances and not at all on his professional dealings. Edmund did not believe her, or perhaps did not wish to believe her, since blaming Clara proved far simpler than examining whatever genuine business concerns might have led Henry to reconsider the arrangement. He accused her once more of destroying the family's stability through her selfish pursuit of some fantasy relationship with a man far above her station, warning her that she had likely ruined not only her marriage but the financial security of her own children through her recklessness. The call ended with him hanging up abruptly, leaving Clara sitting in stunned silence, uncertain how to process an accusation that felt both deeply unfair and, in some small hidden corner of her mind, slightly frightening in its implications. She reached out to Henry later that same morning, uncertain what she hoped to hear, only that she needed clarity after Edmund's confusing accusations. Henry answered her call immediately, his voice calm and reassuring, explaining that his decision to withdraw from the contract had nothing to do with Clara directly, but everything to do with concerns his own advisors had raised about the long-term viability of the partnership, concerns that had been building for weeks independent of anything happening in her personal life. He told her plainly that he would not allow Edmund to use business decisions as a weapon against her, and that if anyone deserved blame for the failed negotiation, it belonged entirely to factors having nothing to do with Clara's private circumstances. Relief flooded through her at his words, followed quickly by a fresh wave of guilt at how readily she had half believed Edmund's accusation, how deeply 20 years of conditioning had trained her to assume responsibility for problems that were never truly hers to solve. She thanked Henry for his honesty, and he, sensing perhaps the weight of everything crashing down on her at once, gently suggested they meet again, not to discuss business or accusations, but simply to give her a space away from the chaos, to think clearly about her own path forward. They met that afternoon in a quiet garden on the edge of Henry's estate, away from prying eyes and Edmund's mounting suspicions. The grounds were beautiful in a way Clara had rarely experienced, carefully tended without feeling artificial, full of the kind of quiet beauty that seemed to invite reflection rather than demand attention. Henry walked beside her along a gravel path bordered by late-blooming flowers, saying little at first, allowing the peaceful setting to work its own gentle effect on her frayed nerves. Eventually he spoke, choosing his words with obvious care. He told her that he understood the enormous complexity of what she faced. A marriage crumbling under the weight of years of imbalance, children caught in confusion and loyalty to their father, a mother-in-law who depended on her care, and now, layered atop all of it, a business collapse that Edmund seemed determined to blame on her existence rather than his own choices. He said he would never ask her to make any decision based on him, based on whatever connection had grown between them through their letters and conversations, because he believed firmly that she needed to choose her own path for reasons entirely her own, separate from any influence he might represent. Clara stopped walking and turned to face him fully, moved by the sincerity in his words, by the striking difference between his patient generosity and the demanding entitlement she had known within her marriage for 2 decades. She told him, with a directness that surprised even herself, that she had spent 40 years building her identity entirely around what other people needed from her, and that she genuinely did not know, beneath all of that conditioning, what she herself wanted, separate from guilt, separate from duty, separate even from the warmth she felt toward him. Henry listened without interrupting, his expression patient and understanding, and when she finished speaking, he told her simply that discovering the answer to that question mattered more than anything else, more than her marriage, more than his own hopes for their connection, more than any external pressure from Edmund or her children or the small town that would surely gossip about her choices regardless of what she decided. He told her he believed in her ability to find that answer, and that whatever she ultimately chose, he would respect it fully, without resentment or manipulation. They continued walking through the garden in comfortable silence for a while afterward, and Clara found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply existing in a moment, without calculating its cost to someone else, without anticipating the next demand or the next crisis requiring her immediate attention. The sensation felt almost foreign, this quiet freedom to simply be present, and she understood, walking beside a man who asked nothing of her beyond her own honesty, that she had found something rare and precious, regardless of where the relationship ultimately led. That evening, returning to Lucy's flat, Clara found a message waiting from her son Oliver, longer and more thoughtful than any communication she had received from him in weeks. He wrote that he had overheard his father discussing the failed business deal with a colleague on the phone, blaming Clara in increasingly bitter terms, and that something about hearing his father's cruelty stated so plainly, without Clara present to absorb it quietly, the way she always had unsettled him deeply. He admitted, hesitantly, that he had never really considered what his mother's daily life actually involved, had simply assumed her constant presence and effort as a fixed, unremarkable feature of the household, the way one assumes electricity will simply work without wondering about the effort required to keep it running. Clara read his message with tears gathering in her eyes, moved by this first genuine crack in her son's earlier defensive silence. She wrote back carefully, thanking him for his honesty, telling him that she loved him deeply and that nothing about the current difficulties changed that fact, but also gently reminding him that recognizing her humanity, her own needs and limits, did not diminish his father in some competing sense, only expanded the family's understanding of what fairness within a household truly required. Beatrice called the following day, her voice still uncertain but noticeably softer than during their previous conversations. She asked, tentatively, whether she could visit Clara at Lucy's flat, admitting that the house felt increasingly tense with her father's mounting anger over the failed business deal, and that she missed her mother more than she had expected to when Clara first left. Clara agreed immediately, arranging a time for Beatrice to visit that same afternoon, her heart aching with a complicated mixture of hope and lingering hurt from her daughter's earlier harsh words. When Beatrice arrived, she seemed smaller somehow, less certain of herself than the sharp-tongued teenager who had accused her mother of embarrassing the family weeks earlier. She sat quietly on Lucy's small sofa, twisting her hands together, and finally admitted, in a small voice, that she had been unfair, that she had repeated her father's judgments without truly considering her mother's side of events, and that watching the household unravel without Clara's steady presence had forced her to reckon, uncomfortably, with everything her mother had always quietly managed without acknowledgement or thanks. Clara held her daughter as she cried, feeling something loosen in her own chest that had been tight for weeks, a fragile thread of reconciliation beginning to mend between them even as so much else in her life remained deeply uncertain. She told Beatrice honestly that she did not yet know what would happen with her marriage, that some decisions required more time and clarity than she currently possessed, but that regardless of the outcome, her love for both her children remained unshakable, separate entirely from whatever happened between herself and their father. A week later, Edmund requested a formal meeting, choosing neutral ground at a small solicitor's office rather than confronting her again at Lucy's flat or attempting to summon her home through guilt alone. Clara arrived early, her nerves steady in a way that surprised her, dressed simply but with a quiet confidence she had not felt in years. Edmund arrived looking older than she remembered, the strain of recent weeks evident in the deep lines around his eyes, the business collapse having clearly taken a heavier toll on him than his earlier bluster suggested. He began, awkwardly, by acknowledging that perhaps he had spoken too harshly during their previous conversations, that the loss of the Rothmere contract had rattled him more than he wished to admit, and that redirecting his frustration toward her had been unfair, even if he still did not fully understand what had drawn her to correspond so openly with another man in the first place. It was not the full apology Clara might once have hoped for, but it was more honesty than she had received from him in years, and she found herself listening with genuine attention rather than the practiced patience she usually reserved for his complaints. She told him, calmly and without anger, that she did not blame him entirely for the state of their marriage, that both of them had settled into roles neither had ever consciously chosen, roles that had slowly hollowed out whatever partnership they might once have shared. But she also told him, with unwavering clarity, that she could not continue pretending those roles were sustainable, that she needed a life where her own thoughts and wants held genuine weight, not as an afterthought squeezed between everyone else's demands, but as a fundamental part of how the household functioned. Edmund listened, his expression difficult to read, somewhere between wounded pride and reluctant recognition. He asked, quietly, whether there was any way forward that did not end their marriage entirely, whether counseling or some other change might allow them to rebuild what had been lost. Clara considered the question seriously, understanding that 20 years of shared history and 2 children deserved genuine consideration rather than a hasty dismissal. She told him she was willing to consider it, but only if he was prepared to make real changes, not temporary concessions offered simply to keep her from leaving, but a fundamental shift in how he viewed her role within their partnership. They left the meeting without a firm resolution, agreeing only to consider their options further, to speak with a counselor if Edmund was genuinely willing, and to give the situation the careful thought it deserved, rather than rushing toward either reconciliation or separation out of fear or exhaustion. Clara drove back to Lucy's flat feeling neither triumphant nor defeated, only cautiously aware that the path forward, whatever it became, would require honesty from both of them that neither had practiced in a very long time. Over the following weeks, Edmund made small, tentative efforts that surprised Clara with their sincerity, arranging additional help for his mother without being asked, attempting, awkwardly, to ask Clara about her drawings during a brief visit to collect some of her belongings. But these gestures, however genuine, felt to Clara like the first small steps of a much longer journey, and she remained uncertain whether real transformation was possible after so many years of established patterns, or whether Edmund's efforts, however well-intentioned, would fade once the immediate crisis passed and old habits reasserted themselves. She continued seeing Henry occasionally during this period, always carefully, always mindful of the delicate uncertainty surrounding her marriage, their conversations remaining warm but appropriately restrained given the unresolved nature of her circumstances. He never pressured her toward any particular decision, continuing instead to offer steady, patient support, encouraging her artistic pursuits, introducing her, eventually, to an instructor who agreed to give her private lessons twice a week, a small act of generosity that Clara accepted only after careful consideration, insisting on covering the cost herself from savings she had quietly set aside over the years. Those lessons became a source of genuine joy unlike anything Clara had experienced in decades, the simple pleasure of learning something purely for herself, watching her skills sharpen week by week, rediscovering the particular satisfaction of translating what she saw and felt onto canvas. Her instructor, an older woman named Eleanor who had spent decades teaching art to students of all ages, recognized quickly the raw talent Clara had suppressed for so long, and pushed her gently but firmly to trust her own instincts, rather than seeking approval at every step. In the days that followed this reconciliation, Clara found herself thinking more clearly than she had in weeks about the actual shape of the life she wanted moving forward. She thought of Henry's patient generosity, of Lucy's fierce honesty, of her children's slow, painful awakening to the imbalance they had grown up accepting as normal, of Margaret's unexpected clarity from her sickbed, and of Edmund's continued refusal to examine his own role in the collapse of both his marriage and his business relationship. Piece by piece, a clearer picture began forming in her mind, not of a dramatic rescue by a wealthy man, but of a genuine, hard-won reclamation of her own identity, built slowly through honest reflection rather than sudden transformation. She understood, finally, that whatever role Henry might eventually play in her future, the true turning point had never truly been about him at all, but about her own long-overdue recognition that 40 years of sacrifice did not obligate her to another 40 years of the same, that love and duty, properly understood, required reciprocity rather than endless one-sided giving. It was a realization that had been building slowly since that first dinner conversation, through every letter, every confrontation, every quiet moment of reflection on Lucy's small balcony, and now, standing at last on the edge of a genuine decision about her own future, Clara felt ready, for the first time in her adult life, to choose deliberately rather than simply endure. Late one evening, after her art lesson had run longer than usual, Clara sat with Eleanor over tea, discussing a small local exhibition the older woman thought Clara's recent work might be ready for. The idea both thrilled and terrified her, the thought of strangers viewing something she had created purely from her own vision, without any practical purpose beyond the expression itself. Eleanor told her, with the blunt kindness of someone who had seen many students doubt themselves unnecessarily, that talent held quietly to oneself served no one, least of all the person carrying it, and that Clara owed herself the experience of being seen fully, not just by a husband or children who had grown accustomed to overlooking her, but by the wider world she had spent so long hidden from. Walking home that night through streets grown familiar during her weeks away from her old life, Clara turned Eleanor's words over carefully, weighing them against everything else pressing on her mind. Edmund's tentative efforts at change, her children's slow, uneven progress toward understanding, Henry's quiet, steady presence at the edges of her days, Margaret's continued need for care and comfort. She realized that all of these threads, however tangled, were leading her toward the same essential question she had been circling for weeks. Not which man she might choose, not which household she might return to, but what kind of woman she intended to become for the remaining decades of her life, and whether she finally possessed the courage to choose that answer for herself, regardless of what anyone else expected or demanded of her. The papers sat on the solicitor's desk between them, final and irreversible, and Clara's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of a decision 2 decades in the making finally reaching its conclusion. Edmund sat across from her, his expression subdued rather than angry, the months since their separation having worn away much of his earlier defensiveness. Their attempts at counseling, undertaken cautiously over the preceding weeks, had revealed what Clara already suspected in her heart, that Edmund's willingness to change existed only within narrow limits, enough to express regret, not enough to fundamentally restructure a partnership built on decades of imbalance. He had grown more attentive, certainly, more willing to ask about her day, but the deeper transformation Clara needed, a genuine partnership rather than a managed household, remained beyond what he seemed capable of offering, even with the best of intentions. She signed the papers with a steady hand, formally ending a marriage that had defined the majority of her adult life, and felt, in that moment, not triumph or relief exactly, but a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of an ending that had been approaching for a very long time, long before Henry's letters or the confrontation in the kitchen had brought it into sharp focus. Edmund signed after her, his own hand less steady than hers, and when he finally looked up, his eyes held something close to genuine sorrow rather than lingering anger. He told her, quietly, that he hoped she would find whatever she was searching for, and that despite everything, he did not regret the years they had shared, even as he acknowledged, with visible difficulty, that he had failed to see her clearly for far too long. Clara accepted this imperfect farewell with more grace than she might have managed months earlier, understanding that Edmund, like herself, had been shaped by patterns neither of them had consciously chosen, and that recognizing this did not excuse the harm caused, but did allow for a measure of peace as they closed this chapter of their lives. The months following the divorce brought their own difficult adjustments. Oliver, now away at university, remained somewhat distant, processing the change in his own time, though his messages grew steadily warmer as the initial shock faded into something closer to understanding. Beatrice, still living primarily with her father but visiting Clara frequently, had become, unexpectedly, one of her mother's staunchest supporters, often accompanying her to art lessons and asking, with genuine curiosity, about the techniques Eleanor was teaching her. In the weeks immediately after the divorce, Clara found herself navigating an unfamiliar loneliness alongside the freedom she had fought so hard to reclaim, discovering that independence, however necessary and hard-won, carried its own quiet weight. There were evenings in her new flat when the silence felt less like peace and more like absence, when old habits urged her to check on someone, anyone, only to remember that no one currently required her constant attention. She learned, slowly, to sit with that silence rather than filling it out of anxious habit, to recognize the difference between loneliness and simple solitude, and to find, within that difference, an unexpected kind of comfort. Lucy remained a steady presence throughout this adjustment, insisting on regular dinners together, drawing Clara along to community events she would never have attended during her married years, gently pushing her friend to build a social life independent of the roles she had occupied for so long. Through Lucy, Clara met other women navigating similar transitions, divorced or widowed or simply awakened, as she had been, to lives they no longer wished to live, in service to others alone. And within this small, growing circle of friendship, Clara found a form of community she had not realized she was missing. Margaret's care arrangements shifted as well, Clara continuing to visit regularly even after the divorce, unwilling to abandon the tenderness she had built with the older woman over years of devoted attention, though she no longer bore sole responsibility for the daily details of her care. Edmund, to his credit, arranged additional support for his mother without complaint, a small but meaningful sign of the growth Clara hoped, for his sake, would continue even without her presence to prompt it. Clara moved into a small flat of her own, modest but entirely hers, the first space in her adult life decorated according to nobody's preferences but her own. She filled it slowly with canvases and art supplies, with furniture chosen for comfort rather than impression, with the quiet, accumulating evidence of a life finally being built around her own genuine preferences, rather than the constant management of everyone else's needs. Her relationship with Henry developed slowly during this period, deliberately unhurried, both of them understanding the importance of allowing Clara the space to rebuild her own identity, before layering a new partnership atop the foundation she was still carefully constructing. They saw each other regularly, their conversations remaining as easy and genuine as they had been from that very first dinner months earlier. But Henry never pressed for anything beyond what Clara herself was ready to offer. content to let their connection deepen at whatever pace felt authentic to her. Eleanor's suggestion of a local exhibition eventually became reality, and Clara spent weeks preparing a small collection of her recent work, paintings of hands mostly, weathered and gentle, strong and trembling, each one telling a quiet story about the life behind it. She approached the exhibition with a nervousness that surprised her, having grown accustomed over the preceding months to a quiet, private practice of painting purely for herself, and the prospect of public exposure felt like a significant and somewhat frightening escalation of the vulnerability she had only recently allowed herself to embrace. The evening of the exhibition arrived with a soft autumn rain falling outside the small gallery Eleanor had arranged, and Clara stood near her paintings feeling simultaneously proud and exposed, watching strangers pause before her work, some moving quickly past, others lingering with genuine interest that she found almost overwhelming to witness directly. Lucy arrived early, practically glowing with pride, embracing Clara warmly before the other guests began arriving in greater numbers. Beatrice came as well, standing proudly beside her mother's paintings, telling curious visitors, with obvious pride, that the artist was her mother, a comment that brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes each time she overheard it. Oliver, home briefly from university, arrived later in the evening, studying each painting with quiet, careful attention before finding his mother and telling her, somewhat awkwardly but with clear sincerity, that he had never fully understood what she had given up for the family, until he saw, laid out plainly in each careful brushstroke, the talent and vision she had suppressed for so many years on their behalf. Henry arrived toward the middle of the evening, standing quietly at the edges of the gathering at first, allowing Clara the space to receive her guests and enjoy her own moment without the complication of public speculation about their relationship. Eventually, as the crowd thinned, he found his way to her side, and together they walked slowly through the small collection, Clara explaining, for the first time aloud to anyone, the particular story behind each piece: the hands of a woman she had observed at the market, the hands of Margaret during a peaceful afternoon visit, her own hands, painted from careful observation in a small mirror, propped beside her easel, during long, quiet evenings of practice. Henry listened with the same patient attention he had shown from their very first conversation, and when Clara finished describing the final painting, he told her, simply and honestly, that watching her speak about her own work with such confidence and clarity felt like witnessing the completion of something that had begun the moment they first met, a woman finally stepping fully into the life and identity that had always belonged to her, waiting patiently beneath years of obligation for the chance to emerge. Clara felt the truth of his words settle warmly in her chest, understanding, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that the woman standing in this small gallery, surrounded by her own work, supported by a daughter who had learned to see her clearly, and a son slowly finding his way toward the same understanding, cared for by a devoted friend, and courted gently by a man who valued her wholeness rather than her usefulness, bore little resemblance to the exhausted, invisible woman who had stood at her kitchen sink barely recognizing her own reflection less than a year earlier. Not every part of that autumn evening felt entirely comfortable. Clara noticed, more than once, a few familiar faces from her old neighborhood pausing at the entrance of the gallery, exchanging quiet whispers before deciding whether to enter, and she understood, without needing to hear the words directly, that her decision to leave Edmund and pursue this new life had become a subject of considerable local gossip. She had expected this, had braced herself for it in the months leading up to the exhibition, and yet the sting of familiar disapproval still reached her in small, sharp moments throughout the evening. One woman, an old acquaintance from her years volunteering at the children's school, approached her paintings with an expression of polite curiosity that did not quite mask her deeper judgment, remarking, with careful diplomacy, that it must be nice to have so much free time now for hobbies. Clara felt the familiar old instinct rise within her, the urge to apologize, to minimize her own achievement, to smooth over the woman's discomfort at the expense of her own pride. But she caught herself before the apology could form, and instead told the woman, simply and without defensiveness, that the paintings represented years of suppressed talent finally given the chance to breathe, and that she was grateful, rather than apologetic, for having found the courage to pursue it. The woman left shortly after, and Clara felt no triumph in the exchange, only a quiet, steady confirmation that she no longer needed external approval to validate a choice she knew, in her own heart, had been the right one. This small moment of resistance to old patterns felt, in its own way, as significant as the larger decisions that had brought her to this point, evidence that the transformation she had undergone was not merely circumstantial, but genuinely internal, woven now into how she carried herself through even minor social frictions. In the weeks following the exhibition, which had been modestly but genuinely successful, several pieces finding buyers who recognized something honest and moving in her work. Clara continued expanding her artistic practice, taking on small commissions alongside her personal projects, building a quiet, sustainable creative life that felt entirely her own. She maintained her careful, patient relationship with Henry, the two of them moving toward a deeper commitment at a pace that honored everything Clara had learned about the importance of choosing her own path deliberately, rather than drifting into arrangements shaped by others' expectations. On a quiet evening several months after the exhibition, Henry proposed to her in the same garden where they had walked together during one of their earliest meetings, choosing his words with the same careful sincerity he had shown throughout their entire relationship, telling her that he did not wish to offer her rescue or reinvention, only genuine partnership between equals, a life built together rather than one absorbed entirely into either of their existing patterns. Clara accepted, not with the breathless urgency of a woman seeking escape, but with the calm, considered certainty of someone who had finally learned to recognize her own worth clearly enough to choose a partnership that honored it fully. Their wedding, held quietly the following spring, included both of Clara's children, Oliver standing proudly beside his mother, Beatrice serving as her witness with visible joy, and even Margaret, frail but present, who told Clara during a quiet moment before the ceremony that she had never seen her look so completely, unmistakably herself. Edmund did not attend, though he sent a brief, sincere message wishing her happiness, a final gesture of the growth their difficult journey together had, in its own imperfect way, ultimately produced. Standing before her small gathering of loved ones that spring afternoon, 41 years old and dressed simply in a dress she had chosen entirely for herself, Clara thought back to the woman who had stood frozen at her kitchen sink barely a year earlier, staring at a reflection she could not recognize. She understood now, with the hard-won clarity of everything she had endured and overcome, that the woman in that reflection had never truly disappeared, only waited, patiently and persistently, for the chance to be seen, to be asked the right questions, to finally choose, after 40 years of quiet sacrifice, a life built deliberately around her own genuine happiness. As the ceremony concluded and her small collection of loved ones gathered around her in celebration, Clara caught sight of her reflection once more, this time in the glass doors leading out to the garden where she and Henry had first walked together months earlier. The woman looking back at her stood tall, her eyes clear and steady, her smile genuine rather than dutiful, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara recognized, completely and without hesitation, exactly who she was looking at. In the years that followed, Clara's life settled into a rhythm entirely different from the one she had known before, though no less full for its differences. She and Henry built a home together that honored both of their histories, filling it with her paintings alongside pieces of his own family's legacy, creating something new rather than simply merging two old lives. Her studio, a converted room with wide windows facing the garden, became the place she spent her mornings, painting steadily, teaching occasionally, mentoring a handful of younger women who found their way to her through Eleanor's continued network of students eager for guidance from someone who understood, intimately, what it meant to reclaim a suppressed talent later in life. Oliver graduated from university and visited often, bringing, eventually, a partner of his own whom Clara welcomed warmly into the growing circle of people she considered family. Beatrice, older now and finding her own way through early adulthood, credited her mother openly, in conversations with friends and eventually in her own choices, with teaching her that a woman's worth was never meant to be measured solely by what she sacrificed for others. Margaret passed peacefully several years later, with Clara at her bedside until the end, having remained devoted to the older woman's care and comfort long after any obligation required it, out of genuine affection rather than duty. Edmund, for his part, eventually remarried, and on the rare occasions their paths crossed at family gatherings involving their children, the interactions carried a quiet, respectful distance that spoke to whatever peace both of them had ultimately made with the ending of their shared history. He told Beatrice once, during a quiet conversation Clara only heard about secondhand, that watching her mother build a life so fully her own had, in its own painful way, taught him something about partnership he wished he had understood decades earlier. Clara continued painting for the rest of her life, her work growing steadily more confident and recognized within regional circles, though she never sought fame beyond the genuine satisfaction the practice itself provided her. She often told the younger women she mentored that the most important lesson she had ever learned arrived not through any single dramatic moment, but through the slow, difficult accumulation of small, honest choices, each one built upon the last, each one moving her steadily away from a life defined entirely by others' needs and toward one shaped, finally, by her own quiet, persistent voice. She was no longer simply a mother, a wife, a caretaker defined entirely by what others needed from her. She was, finally and unmistakably, herself. A woman who had given her best years to everyone around her, and who had discovered, at 40, that it was never too late to choose her own. 10 years after that quiet spring wedding in Henry's garden, a letter arrived at Clara's studio from a gallery in London, the very city she had once dreamed of as a 19-year-old girl folding an acceptance letter into the bottom of a drawer. The gallery had heard of her work through a mutual acquaintance and wished to feature a full collection, her first major exhibition beyond the regional shows she had grown comfortably accustomed to over the years. Clara read the letter standing in the same studio where she had painted her very first hands a decade earlier, and felt the strange, full-circle sensation of a promise finally kept to a version of herself she had once feared lost forever. She called Henry into the room to share the news, and he read the letter twice before pulling her into an embrace, telling her, with the same steady sincerity he had shown from their very first conversation, that he had never doubted this day would come, only wondered how long it might take the world to catch up to what he had recognized in her from the beginning. Clara laughed, something easy and unguarded, and told him that 10 years ago she would never have believed a stranger's simple question about her interests could eventually lead to a London gallery wanting her work, and he reminded her, gently, that it had never truly been about the question itself, only about her own long-overdue willingness to answer it honestly. Preparing for the London exhibition required months of dedicated work, and Clara approached the challenge with a discipline and confidence that would have astonished the exhausted woman she had once been, staring blankly into a kitchen window, unable to recognize her own reflection. She selected pieces spanning her entire artistic journey, from the tentative early sketches rediscovered in her old attic to the confident, mature work of recent years, arranging them in a way that told, without words, the story of a woman gradually reclaiming herself piece by piece. Beatrice, now married with a young daughter of her own, insisted on traveling to London for the opening, bringing along little Grace, who toddled through the gallery on unsteady legs, utterly unaware of the significance of the paintings surrounding her, but delighted by the colors and shapes regardless. Clara watched her granddaughter reach toward one particular painting, a study of an elderly woman's weathered hands folded in quiet rest, and felt a wave of emotion so profound it nearly overwhelmed her, understanding that this small child would grow up in a world where her grandmother's story served as living proof that reinvention remained possible at any age, that duty and self-fulfillment need not exist as permanent opposites. Oliver arrived as well, now a father himself, his own son solemnly examining each painting with the serious concentration only very young children manage to summon for things they do not yet understand but sense are important. He told Clara, during a quiet moment away from the crowd, that he often thought of the message he had sent her years earlier, admitting he had never truly considered her daily sacrifices until circumstances forced the recognition upon him, and that watching his own children now, he found himself determined to raise them with an awareness of fairness and reciprocity within their future households that he himself had been slow to develop. Lucy attended too, older now but still possessing the same fierce directness that had sustained Clara through the most difficult months of her transformation. She stood before the largest painting in the collection, a piece Clara had created specifically for this exhibition, depicting two women's hands intertwined, one weathered by decades of quiet labor, the other smooth and steady with newfound purpose, and told Clara, with tears she rarely allowed herself to show, that watching her closest friend build this life from the wreckage of the one she had left behind remained the proudest thing she had witnessed in her own long life. The exhibition proved a resounding success, critics praising the emotional honesty woven through every carefully rendered detail, several major pieces selling within the opening week, and invitations for future shows arriving steadily in the months that followed. Clara found herself, at 51 years old, recognized within artistic circles she could never have imagined accessing during her years of quiet domestic sacrifice, and yet she remained grounded throughout the sudden attention, understanding deeply that the recognition, however gratifying, mattered far less than the internal transformation that had made the work possible in the first place. During a quiet evening after the opening, sitting together in their London hotel room while the city hummed softly outside their window, Henry asked Clara whether she ever regretted the years spent waiting, the decades given so completely to others before she had finally claimed this different path for herself. Clara considered the question seriously, understanding it deserved more than a simple reflexive answer, and told him, after a long, thoughtful pause, that regret felt like the wrong word entirely for what she carried about those years. She explained that the woman who had raised her siblings, who had nursed her children through countless illnesses, who had cared for Margaret with genuine tenderness through her final difficult years, was not separate from the woman standing before him now, an accomplished artist celebrated in a London gallery, but rather the very foundation upon which this later transformation had been built. The patience she had learned through decades of caregiving, the deep well of empathy developed through years of putting others first, had not been wasted time to overcome, but genuine skills that now informed every painting she created, every relationship she nurtured, every quiet act of generosity she extended to the younger women she mentored. What she did carry regret about, she told him honestly, was not the giving itself, but the silence surrounding it. The decades spent believing her own needs held no legitimate place alongside her devotion to others. The years spent disappearing so completely that she had genuinely forgotten, for a long stretch of her life, that she was allowed to want anything for herself at all. That silence, she said, had cost her more than the sacrifice ever had, robbing her not of her capacity to love others generously, but of her right to expect love and consideration flowing back toward her in equal measure. Henry listened to this reflection with the same patient attention he had shown from the very beginning of their connection, and told her, quietly, that he believed this understanding, hard-won through so much difficulty, was precisely what made her paintings resonate so deeply with strangers who had never met her, who knew nothing of her personal history, and yet recognized something universal and true in the quiet dignity of every hand she rendered on canvas. He told her that her work spoke to anyone who had ever given more than they received, anyone who had ever wondered whether reclaiming their own life came too late, offering them, through her art, a quiet and powerful reassurance that it never truly did. Clara fell asleep that night with Henry's steady presence beside her, the city lights of London filtering softly through the curtains, thinking not of the exhibition's success or the critical praise that had already begun accumulating in the morning papers, but of the simple, profound gift of having finally learned, at 40, what it meant to choose herself, and of everything that single choice had allowed to unfold in the years that followed. She thought of Grace, her small granddaughter reaching toward a painting she could not yet understand, and hoped, with the quiet fierceness of a woman who had fought hard for her own becoming, that the little girl would grow up in a world shaped just slightly differently because of the example her grandmother had finally, after so many years of silence, dared to set. Later that same day, a young journalist requested a brief interview for a small arts publication, and Clara agreed, sitting with the woman in a quiet corner of the gallery cafe, while Henry occupied Grace with a picture book nearby. The journalist, perhaps 30 years old and clearly still finding her own footing in a demanding profession, asked Clara what advice she might offer to women who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their immediate control, women who had perhaps set aside their own ambitions for the sake of family obligations they could not easily refuse. Clara considered the question with the same seriousness she brought to every genuine inquiry about her journey, understanding that her answer might reach someone standing exactly where she herself had once stood, frozen and invisible at a kitchen sink, uncertain whether any different life remained possible. She told the young woman that she would never suggest abandoning genuine responsibilities carelessly, that caring for family members who depended on her had never been something she regretted, but that the danger lay not in caregiving itself, but in the slow, quiet erasure that happened when a person's own voice went unheard for too many years running. She encouraged the journalist to remember that small acts of self-recognition mattered enormously, even amid the busiest and most demanding seasons of caregiving. A stolen hour with a sketchbook, an honest conversation with a trusted friend, the simple discipline of naming one's own wants aloud even when no immediate change seemed possible. She explained that these small acts, however insignificant they might feel in the moment, kept a person's core identity alive beneath the weight of obligation, ready to be reclaimed fully whenever circumstances finally allowed for it, rather than lost so completely that reclaiming it required starting entirely from nothing. The journalist thanked her warmly, visibly moved by the conversation, and Clara returned to Henry and Grace feeling the particular satisfaction of having offered something genuinely useful to a stranger, navigating her own uncertain path. It occurred to her, walking back through the gallery among her own paintings, that this quiet act of encouragement, offered freely to someone she would likely never see again, represented its own small continuation of everything her journey had ultimately been about, not simply securing her own happiness, but extending, wherever possible, the same recognition and encouragement she had once received so unexpectedly from a stranger, at her own dinner table many years before. The following morning, before the gallery opened for its second day, Clara walked alone through the quiet exhibition space, pausing before each painting in the soft early light, remembering the particular circumstances that had inspired every piece. the years of struggle and slow awakening that had led her from a forgotten drawer of childhood sketches to this celebrated London gallery. She paused longest before the very first drawing she had ever sent to Henry, the simple study of a bird in flight, now displayed prominently near the entrance, as a reminder of where this remarkable journey had truly begun. Standing there in the quiet morning stillness, Clara understood, with a clarity that had taken her an entire lifetime to earn, that her story was never really about escaping duty for freedom, or choosing romance over sacrifice, but about something far more essential, the fundamental right of every person, however deeply devoted to others, to also remain visible to themselves. She had given her best years to her family, fully and without regret, and at 40, she had finally learned that giving everything to others did not require giving away herself entirely in the process, that a woman could hold both devotion and self-worth in the same open hands, and build, from that difficult but necessary balance, a life more complete and genuine than either extreme could ever have provided alone.